Okay, so yesterday we assigned the handicap parking scenario, which is really there's a lot more going on than just the the inappropriate parking in the handicapped spot. So let's look at the scenario involving Matt and Kenji and discuss legal issues surrounding it. There were a couple questions, and we'll see what kind of interesting perspectives we can come up with to see if it's as interesting as some of the other scenarios we've already been looking at in this class. So, Matt and Kenji take Kenji's brother's car without telling him and drive to a local shopping center. Even before they park inappropriately, they've already engaged in some offensive conduct. So they pull into the shopping center, ignoring the sign, parking for handicapped persons only. They leave the car and enter an electronics shop. After looking around, they buy a new tablet. Then they buy some sandwiches from a street vendor, walk to a nearby park, and while eating, they discover that the tablet does not work. In their hurry to return it, they leave their trash on the park bench. When Matt and Kenji get back to the shopping center, they notice a large dent in one side of their car. The dent appears to be the result of a driver's carelessness and backing out of the space next to them. They also notice that the car has been broken into and that a smartphone has been removed. They call the police to report the accident and threat theft. When the police arrive, they seize a small clear bag containing illegal drugs from behind the car's back seat. Matt and Kenji are arrested. So let's talk about all the things you think they did wrong, and then we'll start to talk about actual crimes and criminal conduct, potential punishments too. Okay, let me catch up on the chat here. You're all on conversation about my coffee. It's a good coffee. It's Ethiopian blend of all things. Does the street vendor have a license? Of all the things going on, Demetrio, you want the street vendor to be shaken down. You want the vendor to be analyzed and to have to comply. But we're going to assume the vendor has a license, that the sandwiches meet health code, and he isn't or she isn't in violation of the law. So, Holly, you're saying took the car without permission. Absolutely. Not his car, not their car. Ignored the handicap parking sign. Boom, you got 2. Littering, 3. And had drugs. Did I miss that about the drugs? Oh, yeah, that's at the end. They seized a small clear bag containing illegal from the backseat of Matt and Kenji. Yeah, and they were in possession of some sort of narcotics. Food is very important. So we're getting some rationales now for their actions, but what I want to do is see if we can begin to classify these crimes or these behaviors. What would you say is the worst thing they did, or the most dangerous? And what would you say is the least? Let's see if we can start to rank in order the actions, the bad actions that they did. Was the brother's car. Having drugs inside the car. Okay, drugs. With littering the least. Where do we put parking in the handicap spot? The parking space is just a fine. Okay, that's excellent. So Julian pointed out the parking space is just a fine, but littering might be a fine as well. And Possession of drugs is another whole level of issue because it could be jail time. So as we are understanding this, on the one hand, we are seeing that different actions are different behaviors, but the way we're classifying the inappropriate conduct is really based on the type of punishment that one will receive for the crime. So if you think you're following along and you're paying attention and you're having good thoughts, see if you can answer this question. How do we classify crime between severity? And what I mean by that is, what do we call the more serious crimes compared to the less serious crimes? Let's break this down. Let's organize our conversation in that perspective. So we've talked about different levels of punishment, but let's now arrange them by classification. So criminal charges against civil charges. So now we're talking about two different types of liability: criminal liability, civil liability. So before we get into a discussion of what is criminal and what's civil, let's look at Julian's response where he says felony versus misdemeanor. This is exactly what I'm getting to. So more serious crimes are called felonies. Less serious crimes are called misdemeanors. But do you see the problem here by saying something is more serious or less serious? Doesn't this get us back into the same exact problem that Holly brings up with morality? Is it immoral if the person doesn't take this action or that action because what may be more serious to one person may be less serious to another? Somebody here may say the possession of drugs is not as serious as littering. Possession of drugs, well, it doesn't even say what kind of drugs it is. Maybe it's not a hardcore narcotic. Maybe it's just marijuana, which is legal in many states for recreational purposes. And if you're 18 or 21, and maybe it's the brother's car, so maybe it's not even a crime. Whereas littering destroys the whole environment and maybe even causes some sort of animal to die. So do you see how people can argue the difference between seriousness? So we don't really want to classify crime by seriousness. We don't want to use that term. Obviously, we want to classify it by seriousness. So we use the term felony and misdemeanor, but these are legal terms. So if you're following and thinking, my question to you is, what then is a felony? What then is a felony? That's what we have to know. And simply saying a more serious crime does not get us there. Crime warranting extended imprisonment. Well, Julian, I love your use of language, but do you see how your term just gets the same issue? Because 1 night in prison for me is extended. 2 nights is extended. But somebody who's a hardened criminal, they could do 1 night in jail standing on their head. So what does this word extended mean? Demetrio says prison time. Well, we want to define that. Prison, not jail. Prison time versus jail. Well, more jail than petty crimes. A felony is a crime that can lead to a year or more in prison. Boom, you got it, Albert. So, felony, these are great. Use your resources. This is what it means to be active. And you know, if this was my class and your phone was out and you Googled it, you learned it. You learned it. And if it was wrong, I would have told you that is wrong. If I didn't know, I'd say I don't know. But we want to be using these things. This isn't a test. where we're evaluating your scope of retained knowledge. So yeah, my classes if you saw my room right now, you'd see I got this screen, I got a second screen over here, I got a third screen over there, and I got a phone. So I'm probably getting some sort of radiation that's coming at me from all angles. But the bottom line is a felony is a crime that's punishable by a year or more in prison, which means a misdemeanor is what? Jail. More than a jail time. It doesn't distinguish between prison or jail. Matthew, you're exactly right. So a misdemeanor is less than a year in jail. So Julian's original point about extended jail time is correct. Now we've just defined exactly what it means. So a felony is more than 1 year in that you face up to. Doesn't mean that's what you'll be sentenced with, but the law on the book is that if you're charged with this crime, you may face up to a year or more in prison. Anything else is a misdemeanor. So we now understand criminal law as being that type of law which has felonies and misdemeanors. It involves your liberty. Your liberty can be taken away, or you can be forced to pay a fine. So earlier, I think it was, let me see, I want to give credit to the person who said it. I'm not finding, but somebody said criminal versus civil law. So there is civil law issues as well. So what's the difference between criminal and civil law? Anybody have a guess as to what civil law is? Yeah, Craig Stalbert. So civil law. Civil law equals suing for money. Yeah, it can certainly is going to be money. Doesn't have to be. It can be for to get somebody to stop doing something as well. But if you injure somebody unintentionally or a car accident, a civil lawsuit is usually between people. Usually between people, civil law, and they are what are called torts. And these are specific types of action where somebody might be liable for their actions. So, which crimes, that's the wrong thing, which actions did these two Matt and Matt and Kenji take that could be civil wrongs? Can you think of any they did that could be civil? The car, parking. Well, taking the car is criminal because that is stealing the car. Parking is not civil because that's a law that an ordinance by the city. So they're not really engaged in conduct against somebody else. They're not liable to somebody else. Now, if they crashed into somebody to take that spot, but parking in a handicap spot is a violation of a criminal law. Now, Leslie, do you think that's going to be a felony or misdemeanor, parking in the handicap spot? What do you think? Misdemeanor, exactly. You're not going to go to jail for a year or more by parking in a handicapped spot. In fact, you probably aren't going to go to jail. It's probably going to be a ticket, which is a fine. Yep. So what else? And not just what else, what have they done that could be civil? Or what piece of the scenario that we've looked at is civil in nature?
Car damage.
In what way, Julian?
Well, the driver who inflicted the damage could sue them for damages.
Oh, right, right. They the person whose car it was, right? And somebody banged into their car. So that's just a car accident. There was no intent to smash into their car. And so there's no criminal intent there, right? That's just bad driving and you're responsible. So hopefully they have insurance. Civil, exactly. What else? Did it say in the scenario that they did this when they should be in school? So how about truancy? Oh, the broken tablet. Yes. So the shop gives them tablets that's broken. That's obviously not criminal. That's a civil issue. Exactly. And what kind of civil issue is that? This is a tough question. False advertising? Well, they didn't trick them. They didn't lie about the product. The broken product isn't a lie, but there's a warranty that would come with the product, right? So it's a warranty issue. We all are familiar with the warranty, merchandise law, warranty. Exactly. The damaged product means that they have to make it right. I think there's one other area of discussion here to separate criminal and civil law. So if you're charged with a crime, and whether it's a felony or misdemeanor, the burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. Have you all heard that phrase before? Beyond a reasonable doubt? So what does it mean? What does that mean? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Mm-hmm. So does it mean that if you're going to be found guilty, there is no same person who could disagree? That sounds a little unreasonable. Think of it this way. Beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean that there are no doubts that the person didn't do it. The doubts just can't be reasonable. Enough evidence to back the charge and definitely prove wrongdoing. It's a pretty high standard, though, don't you think? Really high. Compare that to civil law. If you're trying to get money from the opposing party for damages that they have done, do you know what the burden of proof there is? Do you think it's as high as taking away someone's liberty in a criminal case? Or do you think it's lower? If the government is charging me with a crime and I could go to jail, they have to prove that I did what they're charging me with beyond a reasonable doubt. Very high standard to take away my liberty. But if I am claiming that the person banged into my car and caused this damage, I don't have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. All I have to do is prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. Preponderance of the evidence. So what does that mean? That word preponderance is the key. But doesn't that sound not as high as beyond a reasonable doubt? Some people say preponderance of the evidence is only 51%. And some people say reasonable doubt is about 90 to 95% certain. That's just what people say. There's not a formal definition of those. And so this is the lesson that we've really learned and appreciate right now. And that is two different types of behavior that can be resulting in liability, either criminal or civil. Criminal is broken down into felonies or misdemeanors, and to be found guilty requires a showing of the evidence that is beyond a reasonable doubt. And in regard to civil cases, in order to win the judgment, you just have to prove beyond the preponderance of the evidence. So when we turn to mock trial and we look at mock trial, when we're dealing with a criminal case and one side is the prosecution, your intention is not just to argue the case and make your points. You're constantly trying to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this person is guilty. And so you're constantly saying that to the jury. Now, if you're the defense, what are you saying? You're saying this is not beyond a reasonable doubt. So even if you think this person might be guilty, thinking it isn't enough. They have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, and they didn't meet that standard. They didn't meet that burden. They may have made some good points, but there is reasonable doubt. It could have been these other things that might have happened. So Kenji and Matt went on a joyride spree, but they engaged in a lot of conduct that wasn't appropriate. And as a result, some bad things actually happened to them too. And so they may be in a lot of trouble, but it's also possible that they're also going to have to pay some money for some of this stuff, including being truant, which is a civil violation.